Let me begin by welcoming all of you. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. My name is Bryan Alexander. I'm your host. I'm the creator of the forum. I'm your chief cat herder for the next hour. And I'm delighted to see all of you here today. We have a terrific guest on an incredibly vital topic, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Here in the Future Trends Forum, we've been talking about neo-nationalism from time to time. In fact, we had a kind of emergency session right after the Charlottesville incident 4 years ago. And it's important to think about this in the global context. If you reach back perhaps 10 years into the past, we can think about a whole series of political movements around the world, from the Philippines to the United States, Brazil to India, Turkey, Hungary, and Poland, where various forms of nationalist governments became more and more powerful and had more and more influence. What does this mean for higher education? How does that impact teaching, learning, research, and services? Now, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our guest, who is a great expert in this field. He's the author of a fantastic new book, Neo-Nationalism and Universities, which you can find a link to in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. John is, among other things, an author of a great deal of books, a great deal of articles, and he's a research professor at UC Berkeley. Without any further ado, I'm just going to beam him up on stage so that he can join us. Welcome, Professor Douglass.
Thanks, Bryan, for having me.
It's great to see you. Great to hear you. So tell us right now, just quickly, where are you today with those wonderful bookshelves?
Where am I physically?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm in a little town called Piedmont, which is right near Berkeley, surrounded by Oakland. It's a kind of an oddity, but it's not too bad a commute for me to get to campus, although I haven't been doing that hardly at all lately. So we'll see how it all works out as the semester goes on.
Very good. Very good. I admire the background very much. So we have a tradition on the forum where we ask people to introduce themselves, and to do so by talking about what they plan to do next. So just looking ahead to the next year, what are the big projects or the big topics that are uppermost in your mind?
Well, I will probably do some follow-up on the book itself. It's structured around case studies and then a kind of an overall look, which are beyond the case studies, but largely based on those case studies. And so I'll probably do some more work, because you can only do so many countries in a book. And as we discussed before, autocrats and demagogues and nationalist movements march on. And the pattern keeps going. So I'll do some of that. I've also, I lead or am part of a project that I founded called the Student Experience in the Research University Consortium, and we do surveys of undergraduate students and graduate students, and we have almost all the top public universities in the United States in that group doing these surveys, and they use it for program review. They actually use the data, and and we have international members as well in China, Europe, various places in the world. So we're working on a larger report, kind of taking a look at, well, what are the multiple ways that students are engaged when they're at a research-intensive university? And then finally, after I get through this a bit, I've had this long-term book project that looks at the what I call the nexus of science and economic policy. And it's partly historical, because I am trained as an historian and I like doing those kinds of things to bring it up to contemporary world. But this is this kind of major transition that hasn't really been studied in this particular way. And the U.S. was a leader in that development during the 80s, and the Bayh-Dole Act and all these kinds of things that relate to intellectual property laws and other things. So anyway, that's my agenda at the moment.
Well, those sound like three projects. If you can, I'd love to welcome you to talk about the second one when you get a chance.
Sure, be glad to do that. I mean, I think we have a lot of interesting research coming out of it, but as I said, it's also data that's actually used by institutions, and that's important in terms of this concept of, informed management, informed improvement among universities. So
that's crucial. Thank you for sharing all of that. We have, that gives us some insight into you and your work, but even more, we have your wonderful book that you wrote a lot in and also edited. I just wanted to begin by reading your opening definition, and this actually answers a discussion happening in the chat. Neo-nationalism is a term that describes the rise, and in some cases revival, of extreme right-wing movements in key areas of the world, often characterized by anti-immigrant and xenophobic rhetoric, economic protectionism, constraints on civil liberties, attacks on critics, including journalists and academics, denial of science related to climate change and the environment, and the emergence and empowerment of demagogues and autocrats, which is pretty clear and also pretty sobering. Can you tell us what have been some of the major impacts of this movement on colleges and universities around the world so far?
Well, in the book, and trying to understand what is going on in the world, I developed a very simplistic spectrum, because there are different aspects to neo-nationalism and nationalist movements throughout the world, and historically and contemporary. And so I kind of look at this range from what I say are like, neo-nationalist movements or neo-nationalist parties. And so we could include like Le Pen and that kind of, we could probably maybe include the Republican Party in the United States now, unfortunately, to, actual leaning governments, neo-nationalist leaning governments. I would count the Trump administration as being kind of in that realm. These are just kind of broad ways of looking at it. And then illiberal democracies, and then full autocracies, and there's ranges between those and all. So the impacts vary within that spectrum. And so, and this is one of the messages in the book, is while there are common themes and we see certain things, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of differences, and sometimes they're not all aligned in a very simplistic way. So some of the largest impacts are really happening in these very, serious autocrat or illiberal democracies bordering on autocrats. We can argue as to where they are, but a Russia, a China, and China's influence on Hong Kong. We're seeing where Hong Kong is changing very drastically with the, many reasons, but including the national security law that you may be familiar with, which is very severe penalties for Communist Party defined sedition, which is really changing the nature of higher education in Hong Kong. But you go to Turkey is a really important example after the 2016 coup attempt, in which there's this rivalry between Erdogan and Gulen, and there's a very confusing mix, because for a period, and we see this in other parts, Russia, China too, we see a kind of a drift towards perhaps more liberalization, more greater civil liberties, and now it's kind of tracking back. And again, there's historical reasons and different kinds of things. But if you look at Turkey, after the coup attempt, Erdogan clearly used this as an excuse to clamp down on opposition. And often universities are seen as potential or real targets or real generators of criticism of autocrats or people who want to be autocrats. And so, we had 8,500 or so faculty fired almost immediately after, often supported by university rectors who are appointed politically now, and up to 2,000 staff. Many of these people cannot travel. They get their passports taken away. It's called what Our Contributor in Turkey, which is a really important chapter, I think, by Brendan O'Malley, is a kind of a civil death. They can't really get a job. It's very difficult to live, and you can't leave and try to find a job somewhere else too. So that's kind of at this far end. We're also seeing these kinds of impacts of firing, more kind of not in this mass purge, but these kind of selective firings of academics in China. That also, it's not just academics. Obviously, they're part of a milieu of targeted people, whether they're lawyers who are trying to work for greater civil liberties or these kinds of things. But it even gets even more drastic under Xi, under the Chinese Dream. It's really a significant movement. They basically have informants in classrooms now, for students who are part of a structured attempt to make sure that there is no significant criticism of the current Communist Party or these kinds of things. So there's a large range of these activities to more subtle ones. Well, maybe not so subtle, but, I think in the United States, for example, and other parts, the anti-science, anti-establishment this distrust in public institutions is having a very severe impact. It has, this is an ongoing story. It's not just 5 years ago or beginning with Trump. It's longer than that. But this is also a really significant element. And what I say is, which I hope you can maybe relate to, and the members of the audience, is, this denial about climate change is a significant impact in our ability, in constraining our ability to really be actors in it. And, the Biden administration is tempting, but it is a huge existential threat to humanity, and I think we all kind of recognize it. It's hard to grasp. It's a slow-moving ship, but so those are the kind of range, an example of range. But there are many other examples that I could give.
Well, that's a terrific range. I don't mean terrific as in, boy, that's happy news, but I mean that's incredibly detailed. If by the way, friends, if you have a copy of the book, either a physical or ebook or the Project Muse copy, it's around page 31. Figure 2.2 gives you a really detailed breakdown of all these lines. And again, there's the Brendan O'Malley chapter on Turkey that's really, really strong. Let me just step out of the way from it. The goal of the forum is for all of you to have your questions, for all of you to have your comments. And I want to make sure that you each get a chance to do so. And let me just lead off with our favorite professor of government, Tom Hames. And let me just bring him up on stage so he can share his really deep question. Let's see. Hello, Tom.
Hi, Tom.
There we go. Hello. So, so you kind of hit a sweet spot of me. I wrote an article about nationalism 25 years ago. It's about the differences of definition of nationalism. We're chatting about it in the chat a little bit. But I wanted to ask about something that's a little more subtle here in the United States. For the last, 5 plus 10, almost 10 years now, there have been these periodic flare-ups of controversy around universities inviting right-wing speakers and then having groups protest that, those invitations sometimes being withdrawn, and then that used as fodder for right-wing media to say, look, this is intellectual censorship and so on and so forth. How would you characterize both sides of that, and how does that relate to this discussion as far as the freedom of speech on campuses and how that relates to nationalism?
Hang on one second. We're getting a bit of echo. And John, I'm wondering, are you using headphones or earbuds?
No, I'm not. Am I echoing?
I'm not hearing you echo. I'm hearing everybody echo. Let me just.
Yeah, that usually means it's bouncing back on his end.
Yeah, it may be. Well, John, why don't you give an answer and see how this goes, and then I can tweak with it a little bit.
It's not a problem when he's
turn down
talking.
the volume. Maybe that'll help a little. Berkeley is a great example of this conundrum that you're, noting. When we had a series of events inviting right-wing speakers to the campus by, the Republican Party, and then various the student Republican Party, and then various iterations and versions of that. And it just kind of creates this bad storm of conflicting values. Berkeley really struggled. I mean, I think, as the home of the free speech movement, there's a strong sense that, everybody who has a legitimate, has some expertise, perhaps we should say, besides the person on the street corner yelling at you about something, should be able to speak their mind and present alternative ideas or ideas that perhaps are not mainstream, that kind of thing. And the Berkeley campus really struggled with this and tried to accommodate the first speaker, who will be nameless for fun. And the net effect was that, the Antifa movement, which is this kind of, although the Democratic Party and the leaders try to say it's not a distinct group, there's something. They seem organized. Anarchists and others came to campus and just, they were in many ways, in that particular instance, the aggressors. They were the ones lighting trash cans, throwing them into windows, and basically making it so this couldn't happen. At the same time, there was information that this could be a problem. There was arguments, did they provide enough police and all these kind of things, but it was at a huge expense to the campus because they had to pay for this. They had to bring in police from the city of Berkeley because they didn't have enough. And anyway, so then there's been a series of other events in which conflict has occurred, and both sides have created a lot of violence, sometimes not to the scale of that first event, but it just fed into the Fox News machinery. And if you may recall, this was like the second week of Trump's administration, and he was tweeting like crazy, of course. And he said, well, if they're not going to let conservative speakers speak at Berkeley, then we're going to take away their federal funding. Which was really a bureaucratic impossibility, but he probably didn't know that, or he showed a lot of ignorance, and his entire administration has showed tremendous ignorance about how higher ed works in the United States and how it's funded and all that kind of thing. So, I don't know if I'm answering your question directly, but it really is problematic. I think we've kind of actually now settled down. The campus itself, using the Berkeley example, did struggle and had a commission and all these, the normal commission to try to figure out, well, what are the patterns that we can accommodate? And there was more accommodation given, and there was a kind of a reduction in the tension. This was, of course, aligned right with the Black Lives Matter movement. So, but it is a conundrum for universities how to handle extreme right-wing groups. I could say now it used to be the left wing in the 50s and into the 60s, and lots of attempts by the Board of Regents and governing boards and rectors and presidents and all this to control this kind of thing. But it is a conundrum how to handle it properly. Of course, we would love civil discourse, but there is a kind of a heated exchange that results, and then the people don't really understand it costs a lot of money for these campuses to deal with these kinds of these kind of conflicts. I don't know if you're also kind of alluding to the question of like how woke are universities? Are they allowing for free speech on the conservative side? Mm-hmm. I do worry about aspects of that, and there's lots of criticism coming from it. I mean, I'm perhaps not as worried as some people, but I do think it is important. And this gets back to statements about academic freedom. What is it that universities are doing, and how are they accommodating that? And that's an ongoing debate. At the University of California, at least part of that has said, you're not supposed to be a political operative teaching a class, for example, that you're supposed to provide broad range of opinion. That's in policy, and that also has some effect, and courses are reviewed and that kind of thing. Down that rabbit hole of that, but this is an ongoing debate, obviously, with significant criticism coming from outside about how the universities are not really places for conservatives or broad thinking. I don't know if you have an additional thing you want to add to that.
No, I mean, I think, I definitely feel like the middle is lost in a lot of this. And that's my concern, is that you get this sort of way left and way right, and that's all you ever see. And then you lose that civil discourse, and that's extremely important for the intellectual health of our colleges and universities. And if you start developing these camps on both sides, that's not helpful. I mean, there's such a thing as left-wing nationalism or left-wing chauvinism as well as right-wing. And so I was wondering how what do you see as the long-term future there, as far as not just Berkeley, but universities in general, contributing to that civil discourse? And to me, that's how you undermine nationalism, is through conversation, through discourse, because that's how it's built up. And if you can counter the negative narrative with a positive one on all fronts, then your chances of addressing things like climate change without it just being dismissed out of hand by the other side, that's my concern.
Well, this is an issue that's discussed some in the book. I don't know if it is adequately, to tell you the truth. And also from a world perspective and another global perspective, there's so we're talking about different situations in different parts of the world. How can universities promote democracy? There's a new book by President Johns Hopkins on this, but there are many people discussing this, and often it is U.S. centric and we're looking at. But I think of course, yes, universities should be more publicly engaged. They need to go out and try to convince people that they're credible sources of information. There's kind of a list of things that they can do in order to improve that. One of the issues that is brought up in our example about Germany and Hungary and is that academics need to work on their messaging ability and other credible ways of providing information and not. This is the American tradition is much more engaged, believe you me, in terms of public service and these kinds of things. But that's happening in other parts of the world, and they see this as a real deficit. But I also say in the book, this erosion in public institutions or this larger political milieu, universities are just are operating in that environment. Their ability to shift and change things in a significant way, I think, I'm not saying they should, but it really relates to this larger political milieu that they operate in. And then, then you can talk about, well, where can, for example, for Turkey, where can international agencies, NGOs, or, something like UNESCO or OECD, or there are all of these scholars at risk, other NGOs, how much can they help and influence? And when you're talking about getting back to that spectrum, when you're talking about institutions that are operating in illiberal democracy, there's maybe more room for us in the left side of the spectrum, if I can say that, the nationalist movements, and places like France and the United States. But when you get into these illiberal democracies and autocracies, the limit is so limited as to what these institutions can really do. And that's one thing I try to present, even though it has faults. I said, okay, we're taking a kind of a political determinist viewpoint here about how universities operate. And, what is the values they profess and what kind of challenges, public challenges or constructive criticism of society can they undertake? And it really is structured around that. The only other thing I kind of get to, which is also, not new, is just say, you really need leadership, political leadership among, to some degree, Western democracies. It extends more to that. But that, we need to have leaders value science and speak publicly about it, or think structurally how they can approach, within the limited range of things you could do, perhaps to influence Erdogan in Turkey, that it sits within these other important foreign policy objectives. So that's the kind of thing. But, it's none of it is, there's no easy fix.
Right.
Tom, thank you. Thank you for the question. And everybody, if you're new to the forum, this is how visual questions work. You can see we beam you up pretty easily. In fact, just to make it even easier for you, I'm going to put a little button up here, kind of green color or teal colored button. If you want to join us, your mic and camera are on, just press that button and there you'll be. Or if you want to enter a question in the question box, again, that's the bottom of the screen. That's the question mark shaped button. Type it in there. We've had, John, already some interesting questions about a couple of different topics. I want to bring one of them to the fore, which has to do with climate change. It seems like, according to some other political scientists who work in issues of sovereignty, that there's a real challenge in trying to organize the entire human race to try to mitigate or adapt to the climate crisis. And it seems like neo-nationalist ideologies, parties, and governments are going to, in many, not all, but in many cases, block that. What does this mean for us as we get deeper and deeper into the Anthropocene? And what does it mean for colleges and universities trying to grapple with climate change?
Well, I guess I'm not sure I can answer that adequately, but what I would say is that a key component of the modern world of science is collaboration across borders, international. So climate change is in terms of the research and work being done on it, both from the viewpoint of really trying to assess its speed to mitigation, relies on international collaboration and sharing of data. And, one thing that we did see in the COVID vaccine race or the reaction to COVID is the value of international engagement and also of publicly funded research. The mRNA vaccines are almost, significantly based on publicly funded research in universities and in national labs in the United States, and there are some similar patterns in Europe, of course. So that is the value universities bring, I think, to some degree, to the climate change. Then we get to the politics of it, and that's, where can universities really shift and change the value? Well, they can add information, they provide expertise that can help convince, we hope, politicians and these kinds of things. And that's, of course, you should be doing that. And there is, we do have entities. I think most probably public universities in the United States, private and public research universities, have centers on climate change now, which is all tells you a lot. That's how much. But those are kind of the elements that I can see as universities playing a role in this. But is it adequate? I don't know. At the speed we're going, you did, and I think it was important that you noted, again, there are nuances to neo-nationalism, and not every country is anti-science and climate change. And even though, we can look at China as a mixed bag because they are the single largest polluter in the world, and they, just are, there's, I think in the New York Times, more about building more, they're still building coal plants or that kind of thing. They've promised to stop doing that. They're not going to do it with the Belt and Road countries. But they're making, they're also a leader in the development of alternative energy. And so there's an example of kind of a nuance there in that side of neo-nationalism. But, I think we're all extremely worried. I live in California. The fires are not serendipitous. They're really significant. Water change in temperature, or these kinds of things. So universities can play a role in that, and perhaps more. But it's not an easy problem to solve, obviously.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the candor of your response, and also the detail of it. This is definitely one of those hyper objects that we have to grapple with. We have another question coming in from Gabriel Sainz, whose name I always manage to flub. So let me bring him up on stage to apologize to him. Let's see, Gabriel. Hello.
Hi. Good day, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Good.
Wonderful. Such an engaging discussion and timely. We've been trying to reach out to so many of our instructors this semester. And one of the things that is popping up is many instructors are dealing with students whose political affiliations or identity precludes their ability to engage with the course material. This is something we see a lot. And they're isolated incidents. But I never know what to tell these folks. I never know what to... Some of them are concerned about engaging their students with direct confrontation, saying, hey, well, this is just not accurate. In some cases, myself, for example, I need to teach empiricism. And in some cases, it's just not possible to say, hey, this is empirically defendable, this is not. So I was hoping you might have something to say. Do you have any advice for instructors who you kind of have to get under that lip? It feels like it's
which university where are you at?
I'm actually right now at the Ozarks Technical Community College, but I've taught in Missouri State University.
Okay.
Their policy was to avoid politics as much as you can, but in some cases it's just not avoidable.
Are you referring mostly to social science and humanities classes, or would it also bridge, or is your experience seeing it in more like, science STEM courses or these kinds of things?
It's been across the board. So I teach psychology, so research methods in psychology has been an issue, but I've had an instructor teaching high-level chemistry courses. I'm not knowledgeable enough to say what they were doing, but I know that they were talking about things where people just were not receiving the information. An easy one that sticks out, good example, an English course. They're thinking, okay, can we identify whether this source is valuable? What value does it have? Can I critique it? And they had a student that said, okay, well, this resource, its website, it says right at the top, it's a neutral, left-leaning journal. And so they go, okay, well, it says left-leaning. I'm not going to engage at all. All of it is inaccurate information. And so what do you tell that person? What do you tell that instructor?
Well, I have a feeling that there are other people in the audience that could respond better. I'll just say a couple of things. Maybe somebody else could talk about this, because I don't pretend that I'm an expert in this. But there's kind of different parts of this story. And one is, well, where is the institution in protecting your ability to teach, and make sure that, you as the instructor are in charge of your course. You probably, the course was reviewed, one assumes, and there's a process, and the institution has a role to play in providing support and guidance to you as to what you can talk and say about. We went through this long phase, and we're kind of at a different phase here of trying to deal with hate speech. And then it's evolved into other kinds of things, and we're getting this kind of this other part of the story in which, you can't even bring up topics that might get them upset or something. And if they do get upset, they have recourse somehow through the institution. And some of that, we need some of that, but there's also, it feels like is a fair amount of abuse, or there's kind of coddling of students to some degree who are, just can't deal with a larger breadth. But that's why they're in higher ed. Again, we'd have to say, what kind of course are they in, all that. But the institution has a role to play in providing that support structure for you. But after that, this is a cultural phenomena, and it's. I think it might be kind of something we're in the middle of, partly because race and the Black Lives Matter has illuminated really important aspects of American society, but it has other kinds of impacts as well, that it's not all positive, and there are some real issues going on. And that's on the left side. We got the right side too as well. So everything's been politicized to a greater degree. But that's about all I can say on that. I know there are case examples, and you can look at them and say, oh, what does that mean? Well, where's the institution? All that. But I defer to anybody else in the group if they've got something more to say about it.
And I would love to hear from anybody. So again, here, I'll either hit the chat box or hit the Q&A box, or if it's too many buttons to press, just click that teal button, and you'll join us up here on stage. Gabrielle, can you say a bit more about teaching empiricism and empirical methods in the psych class? How did that run into problems with students holding neo-nationalist beliefs?
Sure. Yeah. So the example that I ended up coming up with that I thought would be a very safe example to teach was we brought up a video about someone who said that they have psychic powers, and you might have psychic powers too. And so I asked the students, how would you assess, is this information valid? And that's how we got into the conversation about empiricism. And I had a couple of students, they were allowed to give anonymous discussion, mention that, well, it depends on who's talking. If a certain person that I trust is telling me something, I will believe it if it is coming from an instructor that has not quite won it hasn't got that ethos, it won't work. And so that it's completely glossing over the actual discussion about empiricism, about data, about performing your own assessments, and instead came to really, I'm trying to speak generally, but really what it came to was nationalist or populist sort of movements. I don't know if I'm using those words correctly, but hey, the person who has already won my opinion will dictate all further opinions, if that makes sense.
So it comes to a question of trusting sources first and foremost before trusting the arguments.
Right. And in that case, the empiricism was just not something we could get to. Because at base level, we needed the students to be willing to make their own tests or assessments. What does this button do? Well, I'm going to push it. I'd rather just have someone tell me what the button does. That's really not an effective way to test that.
So it's a sign of extreme polarization right there, where people, their identity, your assessment of their identity is first and foremost. So you have to, I guess the student would want you to convince them that you are trustworthy.
Yes. Yeah. And so, and it does come up, more specific examples that are more clearly conservative. For example, we need to have a discussion about birth control and what works and what does not work in psychology. And that's one of those things where I draw the line there. I believe that it is my duty as an instructor to say what we know works for society. But of course, that causes immediate pushback. That's something I do late in the semester where I hope I've already won some ethos. But
I appreciate that.
Can I ask you, are you like concerned? In other words, you confront these issues that students have different, students have always had different, they're not all the same. They have different opinions. They come from different cultural backgrounds, these kinds of things. And in the Ozarks, perhaps you're facing a more significant kind of student that has problems with some of these things. But do you feel like the institution supports you? In other words, you are the instructor. They've appointed you with this job. You're supposed to have an outline of general academic freedom, whether that's emphasized or not. But do you feel like the institution supports you because you're the instructor, you need to make these choices?
Sure. I hadn't really thought about that question. Depending on the institution, I've always been in conservative institutions. Texas A&M is where I started, then Missouri. So depending on the institution, there are different levels for sure. I think the most common trend is the institution says, we back up what you're saying, but don't stir the pot, if that makes sense. Let's avoid. I wouldn't. If I had an instructor that really got into something, they usually draw the line at I don't want to cause any trouble or I don't want to get in trouble. But right now, with retention being such a tough point with colleges, losing students due to whatever conversation, it's not very desirable.
Well, I thought you were going to go the other way, and John, I thought this was going to be an institutional support question, which is, if you are a tenured faculty member, that's one thing, but if you are a tenured track or more likely adjunct, then that becomes even more risky and difficult.
Yeah.
We've only had one response to this great question, Gabriel. That came up. Tom Hames, we just saw a few minutes ago, said he hasn't had much of an issue teaching this in his U.S. government classes. He focuses heavily on method and data literacy. I accept all viewpoints are backed up by data. So that's, you might want to talk to each other and bounce some ideas as fellow social scientists. That's one way. I was just going to toss in one more myself, which is asking about the role of the library. Because a lot of libraries teach information or digital literacy, and having a librarian in the class, either physically or online, to do a unit or give a talk or just answer questions about sourcing materials, I think might help as well. Like your example of the psychic person. Well, how do you assess that? And we have all kinds of great ways of doing it. That's one thought.
Well, I only want to maybe just transition to the concept of, you're thinking about what can you do in this classroom and things. Now transport yourself to Hong Kong. And, it's not China, but it's getting there. The two systems, the one China, two systems framework is eroding quickly. And the national security law has added extradition abilities, not just in China or in Taiwan, but throughout the world. Actually, that law provides, whether you can do it, and the constraints of these faculty that's still kind of bordering on this world of maybe, Hong Kong is different, and it has high quality universities partly because of its traditions, the British system and the various other kinds of things, but it has a kind of a Western feel to it. But now you can't. You can perhaps. I mean, I don't know for sure. It's not quite like China, but your ability to talk about larger social problems or the governance structure of Hong Kong is severely restricted, and it's getting worse.
And not to mention having people reporting on your behavior in class. Gabriel, I've shared this on Twitter. I've shared this on your question on Facebook. If we get any responses that come back, I'll before the hour is out, I'll bring it back. And otherwise, I'll shoot you a note. Thank you for the excellent question, and thank you for your work.
Appreciate yours.
Everybody else, again, this is the forum which is about your questions and your comments. We've had two very, very rich questions just come in from two great people. So any other questions or comments or thoughts you have about what neo-nationalism means for academia, this is your time and place to share them. We had two quick comments that came up in the chat box. Our dear friend Lisa Durf was wondering about civil discourse and why we focus on civil discourse in academia when it should be everybody else, especially, as she puts it gently, more seasoned citizens, which is a very nice impulse. Michael Zamperini gives us the famous F. Scott Fitzgerald quote. I recommended this for a discussion in Gabriel's class. Quote, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." At a meta level.
That's a good one.
Well, people are still coming up with questions, and they're thinking and ruminating. And again, friends, all of your questions are welcome. I'll pose one for myself, taking the moderator's privilege. What does academia look like worldwide, say 10 years from now, if the neo-nationalist tide continues to roll? That is, if we have a decade with Pish in Poland or Modi in India, or whatever, Duterte's, I think it's his daughter who's going to succeed him in the Philippines, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or if we have a second Trump administration, the US, and so on. What does academia look like after a decade of this?
Well, that's a complicated question. What I can say is that I do think that it appears that autocratic rule will continue in many parts of the world, but there is a waning in some areas. I think we're looking a little bit at, if you've been reading the papers lately, about opposition parties in Hungary and in Poland having some sway potentially, but we'll see. I mean, that's the hopeful scenario. So in other words, it isn't that everything will all be the same, but we have seen an overall increase in autocratic governments, and they tend to have certain tendencies. And I think the biggest worry among many who look at these kinds of issues is the shape of global science, global academic interchange. Many of these have anti-globalist kind of agendas, or very protectionist. So, the Chinese have, there's a story of complication. Xi has come into power, and he said, he made statements about not having any Western influences in teaching and otherwise other activities of institutions. There's these significant impacts on faculty and what they can do and say, and students as well. At the same time, there's the Belt and Road Initiative, which is in a reach out, create a network that's a kind of an alternative network to the United States network of power, reshaping the world, bringing in international students that tend to be short term. They're not long term. They aren't. They're segregated. It's a little different, but they have big numbers, but it's a certain kind of international engagement. But I think part of the worry is, and China's a great example of this, that, we're breaking down with some of the potential collaborations between institutions, universities, research universities in particular, but not only, are real global actors in the modern era. Yes, undergraduates are often, from your home, and there's arguments about how many out-of-state and international, that remains a very kind of bread and butter localized area. But if you look at graduate education, hiring of faculty, it's a global market. But getting back to are we going to see constraints about global interaction of faculty and students, interchange, research, not? And on the U.S. side, concerns that are legitimate. I don't know the extent, and that's the debate of, intellectual property theft, limitations on what kind of interchange universities might have with other institutions. Universities are becoming, in the United States and in the UK and elsewhere, much more careful about all of this interchange. so that could be a casualty as we keep going down the road, that there are these kind of different science systems that are structured around nationalism. But it's going to be a mixed story. I mean, Hungary might be different in 5 or 6 years. It might be more, and this is another thing that's very interesting. Mark Vendevende provides a kind of a look at the EU and what's the effects of those at the periphery of the EU, like Hungary. Students want to leave Hungary. They don't want to. A lot of them, they want to go to the Netherlands, which has great universities and they have open university systems, so there's an impact there. But the other thing she notes of interest is that even with all of this neo-nationalist movement in much of Europe, and the AfD in Germany and these kinds of things, is that the younger people generally believe in the EU mission, which is talent mobility, so they can go and experience other parts of the world of the EU and have benefits from it and get jobs and these kinds of things. So those are kind of trends that tell you something. And I guess that's a question for some of the other parts of the world that I don't know the answer to, really. I could guess. But where, is this not a gender, well, it could be gender too, but an age kind of factor going on. I think, in Hungary and other places, there is data that shows that the younger generation value globalization, governmental agencies like the EU. So it's a story that will evolve.
Well, there's the Brexit and the Trump polling in 2016 showed that they tended to have, the older you were, the more likely you were to vote for Brexit or for Trump. It was less true in 2016. But let me resume being a moderator again. That was a great answer. But let me bring up a question that came up from Charles Finley. Let me flash this on the screen for you all. Since faith is not based on science, I'm wondering how state-sponsored religion plays into neo-nationalism. How do universities participate in faith-based claims to dissemination, for example? Charles always asks powerful questions.
Yeah. Depending on the country, we have definitely seen conservative religious organizations, state-sponsored to some degree, but be participants in neo-nationalist movements in the United States. We see that, the link of that. Obviously, Russia is an interesting example in that, the rebirth to some degree, I guess, of the Orthodox Church is heavily aligned with Putin. So there's an area in which, but not all. I mean, there is no state-sanctioned religion in China. But there are various entities out there trying to evolve, and so religion does play a part, but it depends on where it is in the country. It plays a part in the kind of a dissemination. I think the question at least alludes to the concept that religion is not science-based, and that it can perpetuate conceptual ideas that aren't always healthy for society. And I agree with that. But it does vary a lot in which parts of the country. And then I think the question kind of go to, well, how do you deal with that? And that I don't know, except for, to get back to my old answer, then he can come back and respond and enlighten us. And that is that leaders of major democracies and elsewhere value science. In other words, it becomes even more in the projection of our political leaders that, yes, religion has a place, absolutely, in society. It's, culturally important in many parts of the world or various parts of the United States. But we need leadership to really highlight and value science, besides universities helping to erode or whatever, try to interject, but you have to get that marriage. I think the interesting aspect was we had the leader of the NSF, Francis Collins, was always iterating. I'm a deeply religious man, but I'm also a believer in science. So there's that. You're getting back to the Fitzgerald quote. So maybe another add to that, or was it Charles or no? Who was it?
Yes, that was Charles. The one I was going to mention is a good example of this is Catherine Cahill, Catherine Hayhoe, who is a climate scientist and an evangelical Christian, and she's become kind of a star in making that case. I'll share a quick article about her in the.
Well, this also, this also relates to the general concept of the separation of church and state. And you really, I think, or at least maybe a very Western viewpoint, is that you really cannot have a operating democracy without that value. And so then, you look, we haven't even mentioned in the structure, and we didn't look. I said this in the book. We could have picked all kinds of different places. We could have picked North Korea, and but we wouldn't have any information. Or then you look at Afghanistan, or then the great into Pakistan, and I mean, it's like, where you don't have a strong separation of church and state. I do also say, and I've said this in other books, that where you don't have at least semblances of gender equality, I mean, these are societies that are not functional in the way that we would think if we value civil liberties and these kinds of things. So.
That's a great answer. Charles, you just made me rethink a lot of this because so many of these neo-nationalist movements are explicitly about religion, thinking about Erdogan's deployment of a desecularized, more Islamic state in Turkey, or Modi's Indian nationalism, or the Catholicism in Poland, Hungary, Brazil. That's a very, very important question. Friends, we're almost out of time, so I'll give you all about 30 seconds if you want to put forth one more question. We've had a little bit of conversation about religion and nationality back in the chat. I'm curious right now, what are some of the other practical tips you would give to academics who are confronting this movement? I mean, besides reading your whole book, which is the obvious answer, I'm thinking of Gabriel's experience and other people's. Should they turn more towards their universities for institutional support, or what else should academics do?
Well, one plug is that the book is for free. You can get it for free through Project Music. But it doesn't answer all of these questions. I mean, I looked at it when we first put this book together. I had a conference at Berkeley. I got some funding from the Carnegie Corporation, which was very helpful. And it was kind of exploratory. I'm a big believer in case studies. I think there's a lot written that's is broad kind of things about globalization, or, globalization in universities. And it's kind of, but you really need that in-depth work to look at case studies that can tell you something about a complicated phenomena like nationalism, which is, linked to historical aspects, cultural, geography. I keep saying this, geography matters, still matters. So, but your question is getting back to where the individual academic, how can they confront that? Well, it's a big difference if you're confronting it in the United States, even if it's in wherever, some part of America that's not so open to science, so let's put it that way, or something like that. It's a completely different thing if you're in Hong Kong, or you are even in Singapore. There's constraints as to what you can do and say. But if we're really focused, and I think the audience appears, it's a very American, North American audience, and you're probably thinking of those things. I don't have all the answers to that. I think this is an ongoing debate. I get back to, I've had experience. I work with the Academic Senate here at UC Berkeley for a long time doing policy papers. It gets back, and the issue of academic freedom, which is an area that some colleagues of mine are working on at the Center for Studies in Higher Ed. The institutional structure is really important in order to support the faculty as to how they behave in the classroom. Then if you're talking about, well, how can we confront disinformation in society in general, well, boy, that's really complicated as well. You join things, you can write papers, you can engage. So I'm sorry, that's a very inadequate answer, but it's not something I pretend that I really have the answer to.
Well, it's a very honest answer. It's an informative answer. It points us in some really good directions. Now, one direction that I unfortunately have to take is to end this because we're at the end of the hour. John, you've been terrific. You've been so open and so generous, sharing so many thoughts from all this great research from you and from your colleagues. Thank you so much. What's the best way to keep up with you and to follow your new projects?
Well, yeah, I have a webpage at Berkeley. So, I tend to post if I got new publications coming up. And I've done a series of papers and articles in University World News that are based off the book. And Brendan O'Malley did one on Turkey. So we're trying to generate additional things that relate to that. And there are various projects going on out there related to neo-nationalism. So I'm starting to interact with that. But the best way is to look at my webpage at Berkeley.
And to keep up with University World News. Thank you so much. Good luck with these projects. And I meant it. I want to see you back for your one about research universities.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's great. Okay. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thank you, John. And thank you, everybody. But don't go yet. We have a couple of, I just want to show you where we're headed in the next few weeks. And I want to thank everybody. And second, John's, thanks for your good questions. Looking ahead, we have other topics, including enrollment, digital transformation, disability, eco-media literacy, what Google did with scanning books, and libraries and careers. Just go to forum.futureofaeducation.us to learn more. If you'd like to keep talking about this, if you want to talk about nationalism, what it means in the classroom, what it means in different countries, the role of geography, we're happy to hear more chat about this on Twitter. It's using the hashtag FTTE. You can tweet at me, Bryan Alexander, or at Shindig Events, or check out my blog, bryanalexander.org, where we definitely talk about this. If you'd like to dive into our archives, where we have hit this several different times, where we've talked about everything from faculty autonomy in the classroom to right-wing movements, just go to tinyurl.com/FDF archive and you can learn more and subscribe. And to keep talking and thinking about this, we can only do thanks to all of you helping us do all this. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for thinking together about this vital, vital topic. Good luck with this fall semester. Take care, be safe, and we'll see you next time online. Bye-bye.